Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Uninnocent, Notes on Violence and Mercy by Katharine Blake, narrated by Christina Delaine. It began to seem that one would have to hold in the mind forever two ideas which seemed to be in opposition. The first idea was acceptance, the acceptance, totally without rancor, of life as it is, and men as they are. In the light of this idea, it goes without saying that injustice is commonplace. But the second idea was of equal power, that one must never, in one's own life, accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight them with all one's strength. This fight begins, however, in the heart. James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life. Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verse 19. Part 1. How do we go on? No one, no window. Black water, nail-scratched walls. Your pure face turned away, embarrassed. You, who the earth was for. Jean Valentine, in prison. What Didion wrote about San Francisco, but also America more broadly, was still true. The center was not holding. In her day it was Vietnam and LSD, racism and assassination. 4 decades later it was tent cities and evictions, opioids and meth, school shootings and racism, and prisons filled to their literal ceilings with bodies. I was born in San Francisco, and in my late 20s I moved back after spending most of my life on the East Coast. The move was for a man I loved, still love, but I didn't love San Francisco. The topography made me tense, as if I might topple backward at the crest of each steep hill, as if the houses nestled into hillsides might start sliding. The year before, I'd graduated from law school, and then worked for the Children's Defense Fund in D.C., and when I left that job for San Francisco, it was for love, but also because I'd lost hope. The shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, during which Adam Lanza had killed 26 people, mostly children, had thrown us into a fight for federal gun safety measures, and when we lost that fight, I was angry and disheartened. Around the same time, my 16-year-old cousin, Scott, who'd had a mental break and murdered a child, was being tried as an adult and facing life in prison without parole. The world of the law that I'd studied and worked to be a part of seemed irredeemable. I'm not proud of losing hope. It smacks of weakness. Others have kept theirs in scenarios 1,000 times more harrowing and grave. I didn't yet know that hope is nothing less than a discipline. In any case, bitterness opened the door for me to leave. But also I left for love. I wanted to make a home and a family. I wanted to see if I could make a family different from the one I'd been raised in, which was not an original desire. My mother and father had tried to do this, and maybe their parents had too, in their own confounded ways. Now it was my turn. And leaving D.C. for the man I loved, I'll call him L, seemed like an elemental step in this enduring desire. After a long search, Elle finally found a tiny, whitewashed one-bedroom for us in the Castro, a neighborhood that was not socked in by fog the way others were. Our lives were sun-soaked. But in other ways, down certain streets and alleys and around some corners, San Francisco swirled with apocalyptic darkness. Through the wide bay windows in the bedroom of that apartment, we watched the light change over the face of Corona Heights and listened to the sounds of people living on the street below. We listened to their yelling, swearing, laughing, and fighting each night as we went to sleep. Marijuana smoke drifted through our windows. The perimeter of our building always smelled like piss. In the early morning, as I stepped over sleeping bodies stretched out on flattened cardboard boxes, arms and legs like commas punctuating the sidewalks, I thought of the parents I'd met while fighting for gun legislation, the living cautionary tales meant to put a human face on gun death. All those parents who were missing their children. And here, the second line of the couplet. All these children on the streets of San Francisco, missing from somewhere else. There was a stretch of days when a young man sobbed inconsolably as he paced up and down the block each afternoon. Once or twice he threw his slender body on the sidewalk and beat his fists against the pavement. What troubled me was the chaos, not just the chaos of unhomed lives, but the chaos of fate that they suggested. I couldn't shake the feeling that it all boiled down to chance, that I was the one who ended up sleeping on clean white sheets and not on cardboard boxes, felt like nothing more than luck. I couldn't find any sense of order, divine or otherwise. Shortly after moving to San Francisco, I started teaching at San Quentin State Prison. The course curriculum covered everything from grammar to composition to how to write a 5-paragraph essay and cite sources. In practicing these skills, the men wrote often about their lives before prison, about the women who raised them, their mothers and grandmothers. One wrote about how it felt to get the call that his mother had died while he was locked up and he couldn't say goodbye. Another wrote about the crime that put him in prison. He'd shot the guy who'd killed his little brother, and the way he felt he'd let his mother down because now she was alone. The catch-22. He would have let her down if he hadn't avenged the death. The cell blocks in the prison were like library stacks, rows and rows of stories down every dimly lit hall. San Quentin Prison is settled on the shore of the San Francisco Bay between Mill Valley and San Rafael, some of the most scenic real estate in the country. A 3-bedroom home 10 minutes from the prison will sell for no less, and usually much more, than $1 million. As I walked from the parking lot to the first clearance gate, the disequilibrium of the barbed wire and armed watchtower against the bay at dusk always made me hold my breath. Just as I held my breath in the city, so full of suffering as it was. Which is to say, there was a link between the city and the prison, between the bodies I stepped over in the street as I walked to my car to drive to San Quentin, and the caged bodies in the yard once I arrived. Homelessness and incarceration represent 2 points on a circle, both characterized by a lack of privacy and, paradoxically, invisibility. They also share the condition of something broken. Lives bent and bowed, histories of heartbreak. It was in those days of traveling between San Francisco and San Quentin that I started keeping track of heartbreak. I know I was thinking of Scott when I did. My cousin Scott was a rising junior in high school when he killed a 9-year-old boy he'd never met named Ryan. The night I started thinking about heartbreak, I was thinking of Scott because I'd heard on the car radio that Cree Deeds, a Virginia state senator, had been attacked by his son Gus, who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Gus had stabbed his father in the face and chest, and then shot himself. I'd met Senator Deeds years earlier when I was working on a political campaign in Virginia. I remembered his kind blue eyes. I tried to imagine those eyes with a scar running between them. When I heard about Cree Deeds, I was driving through Haight-Ashbury on my way back from San Quentin. In light of the attack, your host Rachel Martin was interviewing another father of a son with mental illness. There is a debate in this country about mental health and resources, she said. Are people getting the access to care that they need? The father said simply, no, People were not getting the care they needed. And then he said, "I don't know the whole story and probably never will, but the tragedies never end. The tragedies never end." Of course, when the man said those words, he was talking about Cree deeds, but to me it sounded like more. A thesis, a catch-all. It was both personal, a phrase pulled from the depths of his own pain with his own son, and general, a comment on the endlessness of suffering. It was shorthand for how the world looked after Scott's crime, a feeling that filled my days and nights in San Francisco. It was how I felt when I stepped over sleeping bodies and heard fighting below our windows and walked past the old gas chamber at San Quentin. It's how I felt when I got a letter from Scott with the return address marked Death Row. The tragedies never end. So how do we go on? That night when I got home, I opened a Word document and typed it out. The tragedies never end. At the top of the page I wrote heartbreak, and then I stared at it. The word surprised me. It wasn't one I'd thought about very much before, but in that moment I was struck by its precision. It felt good to have a word. I don't mean that I thought my heart was broken, though I think now that it was. I think having your heart broken is as easy as listening to the news or trying to love the world. Rather, I mean it's what I'd been seeing when I looked out my window. My literal window, but also that broader, metaphorical one that defines any worldview. Heartbreak was a word for the pain I saw in families and systems, homelessness and violence, courtrooms and prisons. It was the cause and effect of that pain. And though I would not have said then that my heart was broken, I knew enough to know that the pain I carried inside my own body collected in my chest. The document grew and grew. Over weeks and months and years, I copied sentences from books and poems and plays, conversations with friends, headlines, and studies about hearts, anything that shed light on the nebulous and, to my mind, misunderstood concept of heartbreak. I wrote down questions. Where did the word come from? Why does it mean so many things? How do you keep your heart intact? How do you go on after it breaks? What does justice look like for the broken-hearted? What does it mean to heal? Do you inherit the heartbreak of generations past? What you look for, you will see. Big red slashes of heartbreak out in the world. A shooting, a fire, a failed reconciliation, war and hunger. And then it started echoing down the corridors of my own family history, which brought the past disconcertingly into the present. At night, my mind followed the threads between memories and images, unperturbed by time or logic. Mothers and fathers wait in a room at the Newtown fire station to find out if their children made it out alive. A blond boy who looks like my brother sleeps in the shadows behind my building. My mother's brother Roy lies shot and bleeding under a street light on a hot Texas night. Michael Brown's body lies shot and bleeding on a street for hours. Scott is covered in Ryan's blood. In his obituary photo, Ryan is dressed in a white button-down shirt, smiling. My brother's smile fades when the other boys move away from him at lunchtime, because he was born with a missing hand, a bird's broken wing. My father is drinking a scotch. My father is angry, chasing me up the stairs. My father is taking a swing at his father with a 2x4, and the dust rises in the scuffle. I am drunk, crying on a bathroom floor. My great-grandmother is crying on a bathroom floor, holding the body of her husband, my great-grandfather, who'd put a bullet through his head. Scott's mugshot flashes across the evening news while oil spills into the ocean like ink. I am trying to describe a feeling when time collapses and the edges of experience and history bleed together into something that casts a shadow. For me, this shadow took the shape of heartbreak, and I started writing about it because I thought writing might help me understand it, and I thought that understanding might protect me. Proust writes, "Ideas come to us as the successors to griefs, and griefs, at the moment when they change into ideas, lose some part of their power to injure our heart." This was my half-formed hope. Early depictions of the broken heart, I found, were literal. Cave paintings, dating back to the Ice Age, in which a heart-shaped object is skewered by a spear. The first known instances of the idea as metaphor appear in Sumerian proverbs carved into stone tablets some 5,000 years ago. My fingernail that hurts is clutched in my embrace. My foot that hurts is in my sandal. But who will find my aching heart? May Inanna pour oil on my heart that aches. Then came Eros, or Cupid, who shot arrows through his victims' hearts. His golden-tipped arrows made you fall in love, but his lead-tipped arrows inspired disgust. In both cases, the outcome was usually heartbreak, literal and figurative. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Cupid shoots Apollo with a golden arrow, causing him to fall in love with the nymph Daphne, and then he shoots Daphne with a lead-tipped arrow, causing her to run from Apollo and pray to be turned into a tree. Because her father is the river god Peneus, her prayer is granted. So did Apollo's heart break into flames, the sterile fires that feed on empty hopes. Then Christianity took up the symbol. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart," reads Psalm 34, verse 18. And in Psalm 69, verse 20, "Reproach hath broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. And I looked for some to take pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none." Many seem to meet their Christian God through the doorway of heartbreak. St. Augustine, for example, wrote in his Confessions, "With the arrows of your charity you had pierced our hearts, and we bore your words within us like a sword penetrating us to the core." He also wrote that God draws close only to those whose hearts are crushed. From the 884 times that the word heart appears in the King James Bible, it's clear the word refers not just to romance, but also to the source of oneself, the spirit and all moral and volitional energies. A crushed heart, in other words, is not meant to evoke sentiment. What's at stake is life itself. It was a Thursday. Scott was at home with his sister Megan. The two had spent most days together since school had let out for the summer. Megan was 13, Scott was 16, and it was Scott's job to look after his younger sister while their parents were at work. Megan loved those early weeks of summer because they were spent with her brother. The two had just gotten home from getting breakfast when Scott started to leave the house again, and Megan asked him where he was going. Scott said he was heading to the gym and would be back soon. But instead of going to the gym, he walked to a recreational trail nearby, where people biked and took their dogs, and then he waited at the edge of the path where the woods cleared. Ryan Landers, 9 years old, was riding bikes that morning with his mother and twin brother and some family friends. He'd ridden ahead of his mother, and so when he passed Scott on the trail, he was alone. Scott attacked him. He stabbed him with a box cutter in the chest and back. From the defensive wounds on Ryan's body, it's clear he fought back. The fight ended when Scott slit Ryan's throat. Then Scott got up and left Ryan's body and crossed the path and walked through the woods until he came upon some men working on a house. When the men saw the blood on Scott's clothes, they asked him if he was hurt. He told them to call 911. He told them he'd just stabbed someone. When they asked him why, he said, because he was the first one there. Ryan's mother is a doctor. When she discovered her son's body on the path, she tried to resuscitate him. She gave him CPR and tried to stop the bleeding. Someone called 911, and soon EMTs showed up and took Ryan's body to the hospital. His body because he was already dead. The police showed up at the construction site and took Scott to the station. He would never go home again. That night, reporters started showing up at Scott's family's house. But the story never turned into a sensation because Louisiana had other news to cover. 42 miles off the coast, the BP pipeline was leaking millions of barrels of oil into the ocean. Scott's crime earned local coverage, but the rest of the state barely heard his name. When the worst happens, the notion of luck takes on strange significance. What's lucky when your son murders another mother's son? That there is oil spilling into the ocean. One way to think about heartbreak is in terms of before and after. And the problem when life gets broken into before and after is that the edges of the two pieces are jagged and don't fit back together. So what you're left with is a tear and the space between that the mind keeps trying to make sense of but cannot. There are no clean breaks. The day after the murder, I stand on a busy street in Washington, D.C., and hear my mother's voice on the other end of the phone, electric with regret for what she is about to say. "Honey, something's happened." "What happened?" I say. "Your cousin Scott," she says. "He's had a break." "What do you mean?" I ask. The word break sounds vague and antiquated, like vapors or verklempt. "A psychotic break," she says. "He's killed a little boy." I stop walking. I feel suddenly cold in the heat, and I wave my boyfriend on. We'd been walking with a group of people to watch the World Cup on a big screen in DuPont Circle. "I'll catch up with you later," I whisper. I can't do this with another person looking on or waiting. "Who?" I say into the phone. "Who did he kill?" "A stranger," she says. "No one he knew. A 9-year-old boy riding his bike." "How?" My mouth feels dry. She pauses and then says, "I think he used a knife. Some kind of knife." Scott is 16. I'm 25 and have just finished my first year of law school. A full year of stories about accidents and crimes. Sometimes the stories were cases, and sometimes they were made-up hypos, short for hypotheticals, or fact patterns that the professor would spin off as an exercise in deductive reasoning. From a specific set of facts, sometimes grisly, sometimes mundane, we were meant to deduce and apply a general rule of law. I'd learned to look for facts that lit up with significance in a story about a contract, a nuisance, a betrayal. I tried to shut down the part of me that thought mostly of the characters in the story who just lost everything, or had everything to lose at the mercy of the law. But I wasn't very good at it, this zeroing in on facts. And here again, on the phone with my mother, I falter. As I scan the facts she has given me, bike path, boy, psychotic break, knife, I can't arrange them in any shape that makes sense. Murderer. I'm felled by the moral confusion of the word. Scott is my cousin, but in this moment my stomach turns for what he's taken, a life, a child. And I can tell this surprises my mother, whose loyalties are quick to fall in line. We're going to send money, she says, to help pay for the defense attorney. Will you, too? I don't know, I say. Can I think about it? I guess so, she says, but I already told them you would. I hear the disappointment in her voice, which makes me feel defensive, and in defense I retreat to what I know of justice, no more than the principle of just deserts. In this moment I don't see why Scott deserves our help. It seems to me that the people who need help are the parents of the boy Scott killed, a family I'm certain has been shattered. Which is to say, after a year of law school, I didn't understand justice. I didn't know anything about its life cycle or force in the three-dimensional world of light and shadows, hearts and heartbreak. Where I saw victim and perpetrator, my mother saw two children. Where I saw a family whose son had been taken, she saw two families. I was not yet a mother. I didn't understand that this was a story about two sons, a story on both sides about losing your child, a primal story of pain. And I didn't understand that both boys had fallen prey, one to the violence of murder, and the other to a slow and steady violence, the invisible invasion of disease, ravaging for days and months, maybe years. Silence fills the space between us on the phone, between what my mother understands about this story and what I don't. And I stand on the sidewalk as the heat takes no prisoners, and a group of boys runs past me in their jewel-toned soccer jerseys, sweaty and shouting. A stone drops into water, and the circles ripple out toward infinity. I wasn't close to Scott or his father, Abe, who was my first cousin but a couple of decades older than me. Growing up, I'd seen them only a handful of times, mostly at funerals in Alabama, where my father's side of the family is from. So I agreed to send money along with my parents to help hire an attorney for Scott. And I thought that money might absolve me from further obligation. I resolved to move on, untroubled. But then at night, when I closed my eyes, I saw a wooded bike path, blood. Maggie Nelson, who wrote about her aunt's murder and trial, calls this phenomenon murder mind. I could work all day on my project with a certain distance, blithely looking up bullet or skull in my rhyming dictionary. But in bed at night, I found a smattering of sickening images of violent acts ready and waiting for me. I tried to turn it off. I tried to be someone who didn't think so much, normal and untroubled. I didn't want this to be a story in which I knew the main characters. I didn't want this story in my family. Resistance is a rich soil for disorder. These images course through my mind at random intervals, Nelson writes, but always with the slapping, prehensile force of the return of the repressed. Most everything I knew of Scott before the murder, I knew through my Aunt Louise, my father's older sister. My father loved Louise. She was his only ally in a family of terrorists, a word he uses to describe his mother, father, and brothers. Scott was Louise's first grandchild, and she loved him fiercely. I knew his face from the pictures I saw on the walls and side tables of Louise's Midwestern house.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?